Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you could join us today. Listen, if you're watching us on YouTube, please come and check us out on the many podcast platforms at which you can find the Lunch Hour. If you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, you want to see what's happening here in the studio, go check us out on YouTube. Leave us a rating, leave us a comment, tell your friends, tell your family members, tell your friends, family members, etc. Very much looking forward to today's show, joined by an old and good friend of mine. Again, this is the real pleasure of doing a show like this. His name is Phil Kerpen. He is the founder of American Commitment. He is, I don't even know what your title is at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity.
It's actually president, but it's sort of like a running joke because Steve Moore continues to be, a very executive chairman and founder. And so he gave me the president title, but it's kind of like not the boss, but the president. So it's sort of but I do have the president title.
An American Commitment is the activist policy organization. The Committee to Unleash Prosperity really is the Beatles, the CSNY of the economics world.
Yeah, it's kind of everyone's. It's kind of like a super group.
That's what I'm saying. Beatles, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. That's where I'm going.
It's kind of because what it is
Murderers Row.
They started it. They started it back in 2015, and it was Steve Moore, Steve Forbes, Art Laffer, and Larry Kudlow. And the idea was, let's get kind of the biggest supply side heavy hitters together and try to make sure all the presidential candidates have good tax plans, was essentially the idea. And they pretty much all did, except Rubio's was kind of not that good. But the rest were good. And Trump, they have this great story that Trump walked in and said, who has the biggest tax cut? And they said, like Jeb Bush, whatever. And he's like, mine needs to be bigger. He needs to have the biggest one. And so but Larry Kudlow ended up going into the White House. And so they were sort of short a spot. And Steve asked me to step in, and obviously those are not shoes I can actually fill, but you don't say no to
David
that.
Lee Roth leaves the group, and they come to you and they say, you, Phil, you're Sammy Hagar, you come in and
something like that.
Which is, and listen, Van Hagar, different group from Van Halen, but still a great group in its own right. So, you and I have never had the full-on conversation because we like to dial it back and figure out where things come from. How did you come to be doing this work? What's your story? How did you become involved, interested in the economic side of things, and interested in public policy?
Well, I debated in high school and college, policy debate, and so I sort of was doing a lot of policy debates in an academic context. And I think at some point with that, it's you sort of think, well, why am I not doing this for real?
Sure, of course.
Why am I only talking about it kind of in an academic context? And so kind of when I first came to Washington, it was in 99, I applied for an internship at the Cato Institute, and that's actually where I first met Steve Moore, who I'm now sort of reunited with because we're doing Committee to Unleash Prosperity. And I interned and then I stayed on doing book research for him at Cato, and we did a book called It's Getting Better All the Time, which was a posthumous Julian Simon book with Steve Moore, basically just lots of charts about how everything was getting better and all the doom and gloom was false and that kind of thing. And then when Steve started Club for Growth, I went with him, and I was there for 4 or 5 years, and then he was fired by the board of directors after we had won all our races, which I thought was insane. So I actually was the one person who quit on the conference call. I was like, no, I'm not. I'll go with Steve. Steve, where are we going? And the funny thing is then we started a new group, but 6 months after we started the new group, which was called Free Enterprise Fund, Steve left for the Wall Street Journal, and he's like, you're going to get an offer from them too, and then I never did. And so that was when we sort of parted ways, but we actually... that was a short-lived group, but we had a very big victory at the Supreme Court in Free Enterprise Fund versus Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which struck down the way that board was constituted under Sarbanes-Oxley, and so they can now be fired at will instead of being essentially unfireable. And
the precursor to the CFPB and what they tried to do.
Very similar. That was sort of the case that laid the foundation for that. And interestingly, it was Brett Kavanaugh who wrote the D.C. Circuit dissent, which became essentially the Supreme Court majority opinion. So there's that. And then I went to Americans for Prosperity, and I was there for about 5 or 6 years. And then I started my own group, which I've been running for about 10 years now.
So let's go back to this, because the point you just made about Brett Kavanaugh, and it really underscores the importance of sowing the seeds for things that'll come later. We have a real problem in America generally about instant gratification. We have certainly in the political world, we want instant victories. Talk about the importance of laying the groundwork for things that might happen and might bear fruit years later. The long game.
Well, I think this is something that as conservatives or libertarians, we've been pretty bad at.
Right.
Compared to the
agree.
left. I think that the left has sort of their ideological objectives, and they want universal health care. They're going to work on it decade after decade after decade until they accomplish it. And we have a tendency to try something once and then be like, hey, we tried, and move on to the next thing. And
we tried nothing, and we're all out of ideas.
That's a big problem.
Yeah.
I think that to really get at this, to get at kind of the major issues, the major policy issues, it can take a very long time. You need to have the right alignment of power. You need to have sowed the seeds. You need to have the philosophical foundation. You need to have the policy specifics. Then you need to have the political alignment to actually implement it, and that can take a very long time.
You plant the seeds in the 1970s that Israel's a bad actor, and that the Palestinians have this homeland, and that they're living in an apartheid state. And 4 decades later, all of a sudden, you have college students, behaving like insanity on campuses. I mean, that's what you're saying. You plant the seeds in 1975, 1973, and then 2023. We can't be surprised when we have the left falling all over itself trying to figure out what to do about Israel. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stymie the conversation.
I think in general, the left has done a remarkably good job of this, and they actually, I said you start with kind of the philosophical foundation, then get the policy specifics. Yeah. The left starts actually much earlier. They start in elementary education.
Right, that's exactly it.
And they lay the foundations over much longer timelines, and they've actually done a very good job of rewriting American and world history towards their worldview. But I think that we need to have persistence.
Yes,
and so, for
absolutely.
instance, since even before starting American Commitment, even going back to when I was at Americans for Prosperity, my number one legislative priority for, 15 years or so now has been the REINS Act.
The REINS Act.
And we've passed it in the House a lot.
Yes.
Pretty much every Congress when there's a Republican House, we've passed it, and we still have never had a vote in the Senate even. But I'm increasingly optimistic that the next time we have Republican trifecta, we may actually be able to do it because we put it on a debt ceiling bill this year. And, if we're willing to do that, the Democrats really going to. So I think that we've definitely made progress, and we're maybe getting a little bit better at having the kind of persistence that the left has.
Listen, it was 2016 the first time I ever heard a presidential candidate use the phrase regulatory budgeting. And it happened to be Marco Rubio, say what you will, but the point is it was uttered at a presidential debate. I never thought that was going to happen. And now we are finally at a point where there are not just a handful of us talking about regulatory issues, but it is a genuine part of sort of the center-right conservatarian perspective in terms of dealing with these things. Talk about the REINS Act so that folks understand exactly what it is.
This is a bill. It actually has an incredible sort of human interest story behind it.
Okay.
And the idea itself probably predates this, but this specific incarnation that's called the REINS Act dates from a town hall meeting that took place in 2009 in Campbell County, Kentucky. And a guy named Lloyd Rogers, who was a retired former local judge, took his U.S. Constitution and his water bill to a town hall meeting with his congressman, who was Jeff Davis.
Okay.
And he walked up to his congressman and he said, "Congressman, my U.S. Constitution says Article 1, Section 1, all legislative power is vested in Congress.
Right.
So explain to me how the EPA doubled my water bill without you ever voting on it."
Sure.
And his congressman didn't have an answer.
Right.
He was sort of, "You're right." And he went back to Washington, sat down with his staff, sat down with legislative counsel, and he basically said, look, when a regulatory agency is doing something sort of a legislative character, is doing something that has an impact on people's lives, on the cost of things, on the economy, they ought to be required to send it up here to Congress for our approval rather than just being able to directly implement it. And that's where the genesis of the bill came from. And as it's been sort of refined, it basically says that any rulemaking that is economically significant, and that's been $100 million, Biden's trying to double it to $200 million, so we may need to tighten the definition exactly. But the idea behind it is any rulemaking that is important, that has an important economic impact, the agency should not just be able to promulgate and implement it. They should have to send it as a proposal to Congress and have it voted on, and it should follow the constitutional process. It should need a majority in the House and Senate and either a presidential signature or a veto override before it can take effect. So it's sort of taking the Congressional Review Act and turning it on its head. Instead of the agencies can do whatever they want unless you somehow muster enough votes to stop them. It's the agencies need to write their rules with an eye towards actually getting them approved by the people's elected representatives. And of course, Andrew, we know Congress does lots of stupid things.
Yes.
So they're still going to vote for some dumb regulations, no question. But I think the worst of the worst would be stopped, which means they wouldn't even exist because they'll write something with an eye towards getting Congress to approve it.
Without having to go down the road, of having to worry about the courts and whether or not a court is going to find it. And we have this thing, we can talk about Chevron deference if you want, major questions doctrine, all of those things, without having to worry about the crapshoot of whether or not they're going to agree with us on this. It gets Congress to do its job. I suspect it would hurt if we had within the REINS Act the statutory definition that economically significant equals $100 million a year or more, right? With that would probably, the Democrats would probably say, forget it. We don't want to.
Well, we're not going to get too many Democratic votes. The most recent vote we had on in the House, we had one Democrat who voted for, Jared Golden from Maine. And it's interesting because we used to get a few more. It's been sort of declining, the amount of Democratic support each time. And on the Senate side, several times we had Joe Manchin as a co-sponsor. Yes. We no longer do. So we've for whatever reason, we seem to have gone from 1 to 0 in terms of Democratic support in the Senate. And, I think that the view that the Democrats have is that more power in the elected branches is bad.
Right.
Because the way it is now, you can pass a broad, vague law and sort of punt 100%. It over to whatever agency, and they can do the dirty work. And if it goes badly, say, I didn't do it.
Right. This is the conversation.
So they enjoy that sort of lack of accountability, and it's allowed them, I think, to have to move the country further in the direction of government control and intrusive regulation than they would be able to do if they were taking direct responsibility.
Because they know in the end that it is very hard to fight these things in the courts. You have to find the right venue. You got to find the right plaintiff. You got to demonstrate that you have standing. Once all of those things are done, then you got to figure out that the judge is going to go with your argument. It takes a dozen years.
And by the time you win, you might lose.
Right.
We had this with the mercury air toxic standard from the EPA under Obama, where they shut down hundreds of coal plants with a rule that most of us thought was illegal.
Yeah.
But if you're electric utility and you think the rule might be illegal, but you don't know, you're going to follow it. And so what happened is it eventually got struck down by the Supreme Court, and they put out a statement. The Obama administration put out a statement that was like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. We don't need it anymore."
Right. That's
they've already closed.
And this is, of course, the problem with the various electric vehicle mandates that are out there and the fuel economy standards, because once the rules are in place and all of these automakers have to start retooling and with a mind towards transitioning their fleets by 2030, 2035, 2040, whatever, they're already down that road. They've already invested in the nonsense.
Yeah, it's actually coming even faster than people think. Yeah. And this is probably the single largest regulation that we have from this current administration. And it's interesting. A lot of people know about the subsidies. Right. They know the $7,500 credit, the direct subsidies, the government-funded charging stations, all of that. They get a lot of headlines talking about the carrots.
Right.
But the carrots are not what's going to drive
the
switch to electric vehicles beyond, the 8 or 9% market share where it is now. It's really the stick of mandates. And you look at what they've mandated, and I'm pretty sure these mandates are unlawful. Yeah. And we could get into that if you want.
Sure, please.
You look at what they've done on the mandates, they're mandating for model year 2026, which is
that's right
around the corner because the model years come out before. Model year 2026, they're mandating 17% of vehicle sales are electric vehicles. That's going to be tough because we're at about 8 or 9% now.
Right. How do you mandate that you must sell?
Yeah. And then model year 27, they go to 30%. Okay. And by model year 30, they're at 50%. Yeah. Model year 2032, they're at 67%.
Right.
And the way that they mandated is they've calibrated the fuel economy standards, the miles per gallon from DOT and the greenhouse gas from EPA, which are just two different names for the same thing.
And nonsensical numbers, yes.
But they've calibrated them such that The only way manufacturers can meet them is if they hit the percentage of electric vehicles that's embedded in the rulemaking.
Right.
And so they actually have a table in the EPA version of the rule that has each model year, and what percentage need to be electric vehicles to meet these standards that they've set. And of course, if you're a manufacturer that mostly sells, gas-powered vehicles, you've got to buy credits from the electric vehicle companies to meet the requirement. But that only works if the overall market meets the target. Otherwise, there aren't enough credits. They don't exist. And so what's going to start happening, and we're already seeing this a little bit, but what's going to start happening in much faster than people realize, just in the next couple of years. I mean, it's not going to take until we get to the 50% mandate in 2030. When we hit that, even the 17 in 26 is going to be a challenge. But
and that's the end of 25.
But the 30 in model year 27 is going to be totally impossible. And so what's going to happen is the supply of internal combustion vehicles is going to be artificially restricted because they're not going to be allowed to sell them unless they can get the credits, which won't exist. And so if you want to buy an internal combustion vehicle, they're going to be hard to find.
Yes.
And they're going to cost a fortune.
And let's take it let's sort of go to the other end, which is the politics creating strange bedfellows part of this. We know that it takes fewer employees to make an electric vehicle than it does. We just went through an auto union strike here. Why are the auto unions not up in arms about these mandates? Because this is going to kill the jobs of factory workers in factories that make internal combustion engines.
Well, they've been assured that all the battery factories will be union jobs.
Oh,
and
sure.
They've tried
all the battery factories in China.
They've tried to persuade them. Well, there's something to be in the U.S. with big subsidies. It's interesting. Kansas actually has a big battery factory that's going up, and they canceled the retirement of a coal power plant because they said they need the electricity from the coal plant to build the batteries for the electric vehicles.
Let's talk about this for a second, which is when regulatory structures come into conflict with the overall philosophical goals, when things come into conflict, right? We want one of the examples that I've just been using is we want these vehicles that can go, 1,000 miles on a single charge of your battery. And I know I'm making up these numbers, but the point is to go forever and ever. So it means we need lighter cars, but we need cars that are both light and strong with advanced materials that we aren't making yet. But at the same, and they're going to have to be made by the petrochemical industry. But at the same time, the Biden administration is working to out and out destroy the chemistry industry in the United States. A dozen different mandates, billions of dollars per year in mandates that are killing jobs and killing companies. How does this happen where the various philosophical goals of the left come into conflict with each other and create these impossible situations?
Well, I think that their view is that when their regulations create impossible economic situations, they can blame
business.
They can blame businesses. They can blame companies. They can use it as an opportunity for more regulatory control or more subsidies.
Right. It gives them. They call it market failure.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's why they're okay with these contradictions for the most part. And of course, they also just selectively suspend their own values, right? So we can have 2 decades of save the whales, and then if it's an offshore wind development that's killing whales, it's only a few, and whatever.
Right. It's a way, and actually this is a good segue into the digital stuff that we're talking about here, right? It's the net neutrality is going to cause all kinds of censorship on the internet. We don't like censorship on the internet until we like censorship.
Now
on
they
the
love
internet.
it. Yeah.
And now they love it.
Now because it's only censoring misinformation.
Yes.
No, I mean, the net neutrality debate, I don't know how long it's been going on now, 20 years, I don't know, seemingly forever.
Yes.
And it's one of the stupidest debates in Washington because none of the hypothetical harms have ever occurred.
Right.
Period. Like ever.
Right.
Ever. They've got like 2 examples and they're like decades old and they're not even really good examples. They just use them over and over and over because nothing's happened. We had this... we had the most aggressive, kind of absurd, mangled form of net neutrality for the last 2 years of the Obama administration. Right. They actually said, we're going to reclassify broadband service as a regulated public utility. We're going to use 1930s style regulation to command and control every aspect of it, except once we grant ourselves that power, we're going to mostly forbear from using it and trust us we won't really use it unless we have to, and we'll know it when we see it. And they put these regulations in, and they were in for 2 years, and they never really used any of the power they gave themselves. So I guess you could say that in their favor. But Investment declined pretty significantly from the trend line for the simple reason that, now you have to be worried. You're going to invest billions of dollars and you might not be able to get, if they decide they don't like how you're going to use that network, you're not going to be able to get a return on it. And so under Trump, the FCC said, we're going to go back to the way it was for the 20 years before the last 2 years, and we're going to have basically an unregulated competitive internet where the phone and cable guys compete with each other and we mostly stay out of it and we sort of leave it alone. And you would have thought that they had proposed the most insane, radical idea in history, even though they were just going back to the way it had always been
and
prior to those last 2 years.
Authoritarian, mind you, right?
They went crazy. Almost every single Democrat and media outlet had some story about how this would be the end of the internet and it would be a catastrophe and you'd be blocked and redirected from going to the sites you want to some other site and it would be a hellscape and tweets would load one word at a time. And my favorite was they got all of the LGBT groups to say that there would be mass deaths of gay people because they wouldn't be able to access suicide prevention resources when the internet breaks.
Oh, sure, okay.
So they were literally predicting mass death and all this kind of thing. And
literally dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Yeah, right. By the way, the greatest overregulation 100%, movie in history.
Yes.
Of course.
Yes. From the EPA, and I'm here to help.
Right. I mean, just an absolute classic from that standpoint.
We're talking about Ghostbusters, by the way, in case you're not tracking with us.
None of it happened. You know what did happen when those rules were repealed? This is basically the sum total of what happened. In private investment snapped back to trend, went up dramatically from where it had been from those 2 years. Speeds more than tripled.
Yes.
And prices were actually down for the first couple of years after it was repealed, then more or less flat after that. And even in an inflationary environment, the one thing that really hasn't gotten more expensive is broadband.
Right. And
it's still basically 40 or 50 bucks.
And the only control of content was coming from the government and the left,
and
putting pressure on
the
these
tech platforms that were exempt from the regulations
anyway.
You're not the phone and cable companies that they wanted to regulate. So naturally, here we are at 6 or 7 years after that repeal, and the Democrats, for the first time, have a majority on the FCC because it took them 3 years to get a Democrat confirmed because they were insisting on a total crazy person who was rejected over and over, even by Senate Democrats. Then they said, okay, we'll put a normal crazy instead of over-the-top crazy. And so as soon as they get 3 Democrats on the commission, they voted to bring back, the public utility sort of mangled form of net neutrality.
Title II.
Title II, it's called, which it's pretty, essentially they don't care that they were wrong about it. I mean, I think they deserve massive mockery and ridicule. They don't care that every single prediction was wrong. And in fact, it's one of the best deregulatory success stories you can imagine, right? You get rid of regulations, investment goes up, the service improves in quality, and price goes down. And they say, you know what, this is bad. We need to switch.
So now they want to regulate rates again, but they also want to do content control in the name of national security.
Well, they don't admit content control, but they say national security, we need to have regulation. It's as if the FCC are the experts in national security. And it's almost like we need a new excuse to do what we want to do because our other excuses were bad. The interesting thing about price regulation is the draft version of the net neutrality order had explicit price regulation in it. They actually had a paragraph in there that said, we're not going to do ex-ante price regulation, but after the fact, if we decide your price wasn't just and reasonable, we're going to do ex post. We're going to. They actually took that paragraph out. So it's like, oh, great victory. They're not going to do rate regulation. And then they put out their digital discrimination order.
There we go.
And this one has express rate regulation in it, like rate case style. If you say they're charging me too much and it's a discriminatory disparate impact on whatever protected group, then they have to hold essentially a rate hearing and see who's right about that. So even when you win, you don't win. Right. Because they basically took that little piece out and then they just put it in this other crazy rule. And this digital discrimination rule.
That's what I want to talk about,
this is actually, I think, even worse than the Title II order because this doesn't just apply to the ISPs themselves. It applies to basically any company that touches anything that has anything to do with internet. And so, like the construction company that goes out and digs the ditch down the thing, they now have to worry they might be regulated by the FCC if they have some disparate, practice that has a disparate impact on race or sex or some other protected characteristic.
This gets into the conflict, right? So we know that the justification for all of this is we want to make sure that we're delivering internet service to underserved communities, high-speed broadband access. So now some company is going to go out there, going to lay trenches for fiber optic cable in some lower income neighborhood, but because they're not laying the cable out in, Shaker Heights, But wherever else, then they can be the contractor can be dinged. Well, disparate impact.
Well, yeah, it could have an environmental, and it could be noise. I mean, who knows? I mean, and so, but the way that they wrote this, that's so crazy is you're going to have whole industries that have never interacted with the FCC ever in all of history that are suddenly like, someone can file a discrimination complaint against us at the FCC, and it doesn't have to be intentional discrimination. They adopted a disparate impact standard. So any facially neutral policy that has a disparate statistically has a disparate impact on a protected class, and now you can get hammered with fines by the FCC, an agency you never even thought you had anything to do with. And this is all for equity. The word equity is in there 30 or 40 times. And by the way, Andrew, this is like a classic of what we were talking about before about Congress passing like laws and then the agencies just going and running with it, because this is based on a paragraph that was in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which got, 19 Republican senators voted for it. And I think 13 in the House. And this was the great, we're going to, McConnell was for it because there was bridge money for the Brent Spence Bridge on I-85, which is, like the holy grail of Kentucky and Ohio politicians. And they had all this money for broadband subsidies in there. And then they had this paragraph in there that was like, basically, don't be racist. Don't have digital discrimination. But, what do you think an agency is going to do? So you got all these members now who voted for it. It's like, that's not what we meant. How could they possibly take that paragraph as a, vast new regulatory thing? But
this is where we are.
Don't write paragraphs like that if you don't want them. If you don't want them to abuse it, that's what they do.
Or this is the problem with massive bills that nobody gets to read in advance. And it's, it comes down to it. Somebody saw, probably some staffer, you and I both know, some junior staffer reading through the bills like, they shouldn't be racist. What kind of harm? How could that possibly cause harm to anybody? But this is one of those areas. This gets into the issue of the major questions doctrine, which is this idea that when you have little bits of language here, you can't shove whole sectors of the economy through it, can you? I mean,
Well, that's been that's one of the causes for optimism on a lot of these regulations is that the Supreme Court has been much less willing to let regulatory agencies kind of write their own ticket. And of course, we're going to see whether they're willing to go sort of all the way and accept, sort of an explicit overturning of Chevron in this upcoming session. They're hearing two cases, Loper Bright and Relentless, and they're both herring boats.
Yes, which is weird, but
well, the reason there are two cases is because Ketanji Brown Jackson is recused from the Loper Bright case because she heard it on the lower court. So they said, let's find an identical case so we can have all 9 justices participate. But basically,
let me just explain. Yeah. Chevron is this idea. We've talked about it on the show before. Those of you who've watched before, it was a 1970s case which essentially said
80.
Oh, was it
82 or 83?
Yeah, okay. Well, there you go. Either way, the point is it's a long-standing Supreme Court precedent that says that basically an agency's interpretation of congressional statute, the courts are not going to substitute their judgment for that of the agencies themselves. So if they can make a justification, that justification will get deference.
Unless it's arbitrary and capricious. So they set a very high standard.
Yes.
They set a very high standard of deference to agencies. And what agencies have done is, They don't even need originally it was this language is ambiguous, and because we're the expert agency, we can interpret it with our expertise, and that should be entitled to deference. But increasingly, they take language that isn't even particularly ambiguous, or they just invent language out of whole cloth.
This is how,
and courts say, hey, they're the experts. We'll leave
this
it
is how a dry patch of desert sand in the high desert of Nevada becomes a navigable water of the United States.
Correct.
Through the magic of Chevron.
Correct.
Yes.
Although, I mean, we could go through the
a whole bunch of things.
The 404 case. There's a whole crazy line of those.
But you know what's interesting about
I remember before, remember in Swank and Rapanos, the Army Corps of Engineers argument for navigability was that migratory birds navigate from the waterway and go across state lines, and so there was the glancing goose theory. That was actually the argument they advanced with a straight face, and I think so. We've had some pretty severe absurdity, but in these cases that are going up, it's there's an inspector program. So the fishing boats have to have an inspector on them, that they have to pay for, whose job is to be there and like search for violations for them to be out on the boat. But there's nothing in the law that says
this. So the National Marine Fisheries Service says you have to have this inspector on your boat. But guess what? You have to pay for this inspector's time. No. NIMFS is not going to pay for that time. You're going to pay for it. And here's the interesting thing.
And a lot of these, I think it's like a 2-week course or something. So a lot of these people have never even been out to sea before, and they're like getting seasick, and you're like.
And I know that this is not the issue here, and I've brought this up with some other folks. What I don't understand is how come there's not a regulatory takings argument to be made here as well. I mean, maybe we don't want to confuse the issue, but it's like, it's very clear to me that if you're forcing me to have this person on my boat and you're forcing me to pay for it, that's a very clear taking of money out of my pocket, for some nebulous public benefit.
I think and my friend James Valvo at Cause of Action Institute was sort of, I think, the original architect of using this as the test case for Chevron. And I think the desire was to tee up a completely clean challenge.
Right, sure.
One where you could get directly at the legal issue,
right,
and not have facts that are subject to dispute. And so the idea, this is a program that, you read the statute, it's not in the statute. Right. The agency made it up. Are they allowed to do that?
Right.
I think this was picked because of its sort of ability to cleanly get at the legal question, and I think for that reason they don't want to address another legal question
which is to me, which is a whole other. And that gets back to my default position as being someone, the property rights issues get at the core of what I'm doing. Let me come back to something because we were talking about economic issues at the beginning and the work of the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, which, by the way, does a really great daily email Steve Moore puts out about what's going on in the world from an economic perspective.
Well, we have a whole team. See, it goes under Steve's name.
I know. Yes, I know. It's a whole team but it goes out.
Because I write the first draft every day.
Okay, there you go. So Phil Kerpen,
but the name goes on the final. His name is on it, so he does the final. So it's his voice, but
there you go.
It's a team effort, and John Fund submits a lot of the material as well, so it's a team effort.
Again, it's a super group thing. It's it's your David Crosby writing the first draft, and Steve Moore is a Stephen Stills, and occasionally Neil Young comes. Anyway, sorry, just sort of going through this thing. So there's a real interesting debate going on right now as we're going into the 2024 elections about the public's perception of the economy, and that there are numbers that the administration is putting out that I don't necessarily believe, because they're always revising down those numbers, right? We get a jobs number one month, jobs are great, and then the next month we find out, we're revising down the numbers from the previous month. It's all very Stalinist in general. But you said something in a conversation you and I were part of. Won't talk about the details of it, but the conversation was about the economics numbers going into 2024 and what Biden is going to be touting, or Team Biden is going to be touting. And you said, quoting you back to you, well, maybe the public understands what's happening economically rather than what the numbers are supposedly showing. Talk about that, because let me tee this up also with a little bit more context, because why I brought this up is you were talking about the 80s and the economy earlier. And trickle-down economics and things like that. I watch, one of my guilty pleasures is I watch old episodes of The Tonight Show. And there was a Tonight Show from November of 81 that was on a couple of weeks ago. It was right after David Stockman had been taken to the woodshed by Reagan, and all sorts of jokes about Stockman and trickle-down economics and all of those things. And, it doesn't really work. Of course, it does work. Again, leading to the public perception that the economy was much worse off than it was. Anyway, talk about that.
Well, we have a massive disconnect right now between the sentiment numbers and all the various surveys and polls and kind of the official economic numbers, which have been quite strong. And we have a very strong GDP report. Employment has stayed very strong. Even the inflation numbers have come down pretty substantially. And yet you ask people, how do you feel about the economy? Are you better off under Biden? The numbers, I mean, these are like thermonuclear numbers. Some of the worst numbers that have ever been seen. And so you've got sort of the easy answer, especially for the left-wing pundits, is, people are stupid. They don't know how good they have it, and whatever. And I think that that's wrong. I think that people know what they're experiencing. And the biggest problem that the vast majority of households have is that prices cumulatively have risen much more than income.
Right.
And I think until income catches up to that and even overshoots it substantially enough that people feel they've got a cushion and are ahead of where they were, they're going to continue to say that times are tough because they're continuing to go to the grocery store and it's $240 for 4 bags of things or whatever.
Right, sure.
And their income hasn't gone up that much. And so I think that even with the pretty good economic numbers that we've seen recently, and even with a moderation in inflation, until you've got robust enough income growth to have made up for all of the ground that people lost, they're going to continue to say that they're behind and that they're squeezed. And it's not that they're wrong or unappreciative of how great Biden is. It's that people experience economic change cumulatively.
Sure.
Which is to say, maybe the price when I went to the grocery store this week was the same as it was 2 weeks ago. But if it's double what it was 2 years ago and my income hasn't grown nearly that much, I continue to feel pain.
Right.
And I think that's the problem for Democrats and Biden right now.
I buy a food product for my wife. I won't want to get into specifics, but I buy a food product for my wife that she has just about every day for lunch. She has X and Y. And one of the things I order off of Amazon. And it's a great way for me to keep track of the prices of those things. And so I went to Amazon to order this box of things, and the price was up 25% from where it was 6 months ago. And now it has been steady for the last couple of months, but it's still up substantially. This is what you're talking about here. Right. I got into it with somebody. Now that when we're recording this, it's just before Thanksgiving. Normally I don't talk about that, but a lot of folks are going to the supermarket to buy peanut oil, to fry their turkeys in. Peanut oil, again, up 25% from where it was a year ago. Now I know this because I cook with peanut oil. That sticks in people's craw. And also it's a real impact.
Well, and the other thing is that everyone I know has experienced inflation of some item that they buy regularly that's far in excess of the official numbers.
Right.
So you tell people, total food inflation under Biden is 17% or whatever, and they're like, not what I buy. So I think, whatever's going on in the data is not capturing the experience that people actually have. And so this idea that, people don't know how good they have it, and it's not.
You got the Paul Krugmans of the world, right? This is the Krugman argument that, absent housing and fuel and food, the economy is remaining stable.
I think he said, let me see if I remember this right. He said, if you exclude housing, used cars, food, and energy.
Yes.
Then we're back to 2%.
There you go.
And it's like, so as long as you don't live anywhere, drive anywhere, eat, you're fine.
Heat your home. Yes, that's exactly it. And that's just it, right? As we talk about these things, it's only going to get worse as these other policies come into play, right? The issue of the cars, right? Because if you're forced to buy a used electric vehicle, it's going to be X. But if you want to go and buy a new electric vehicle, it's X. A used internal combustion engine vehicle, it's going to be Y. At the same time, fuel prices are going to go up. By the way, which to me is the interesting thing, and I'm hoping I didn't jinx it because I've been predicting that fuel prices are going to be up because of what the Biden administration is doing, well above this is gasoline prices are going to be up, but gasoline prices are down now in the post Memorial Day world.
We've got a global demand slowdown right now. Yeah. We may be headed for global recession, and so that's why prices are down pretty substantially. But I think the energy policies of this administration have been basically insane.
Right.
And we've got there was actually a study that Casey Mulligan did for Committee to Unleash Prosperity that looked at where U.S. production should be based on price and the trend line and productivity gains. And he's got it something like 2 or 3 million barrels a day higher than it is right now. And you know what the left likes simplistic analysis. And so they'll just say, we're at a record high in production, so they must be lying. We've done nothing anti-energy. And it's like, we're like just at a record high. We've just reached back at the Trump record essentially. But if we'd been following the trend line, we should have been on based on world prices and productivity. We should be the high should be much, much higher than it is. Yeah. And it's not because of all these policy thumbs that are on the scale. And you've got at the same time, you've got all these anti-energy policies for Alaska in particular and other places in the United States.
Joining the Gulf,
they're cutting a deal with Venezuela to ease sanctions. They're basically turning a blind eye while Iran massively cheats on sanctions.
Which, by the way, has a worse environmental impact both locally and globally because
for sure,
because
we are the cleanest producers in the world,
and produces the cleanest oil also as well.
Right.
Yes.
The U.S. is almost all light sweet crude, and so it's much less energy intensive to refine than the sources from like Venezuela, which are heavy sour, but. This administration's philosophy on many things is that U.S. bad, foreign good, even if it's the enemies of our country. And so, I think we've had some very bad energy policies, but what people see is that price at the pump. And so, if that continues to decline based on sort of global demand weakening, then we don't know how far that'll go. I'm concerned that we may be headed for a recession next year based on sort of some of these long-term leading indicators. And then, of course, the question is, does the Fed stay the course, or does the Fed flip right back into zero interest rate type policies and do massive rate cuts and go back into quantitative easing and try to bring the punch bowl back full force? And if they do, that would probably be very good politically for Joe Biden, but it would be very harmful economically.
Yes.
And, we'd have another big bout of inflation as a consequence of that.
It is insane to me how feckless this administration seems to be in terms of figuring out. I mean, actually, I say this because, right, in the end, the two choices are it's either it's by design, right, that they know what they're doing. I think there's a case that can be made that they do and they just don't care, or they don't know what they're doing and they're just sort of stumbling around trying to do X, Y, and Z in the hopes of having something stick in terms of economic growth. The point is, either way, it leaves us with an incredibly weak economy, right? I mean, there's no two ways about it.
Well, I mean, the thing is, the American economy is typically stronger than the ability of stupid politicians to wreck it. And so, you can't keep it down for that long.
Right.
One of the things that was incredible to me during the lockdown period is, millions of businesses were destroyed, but millions were created.
Yes.
People were like, I'm going to sell ultra cleaning and I'm going to sell, the masks, and I'm going to do, I'm going to look for the opportunity.
I know somebody.
Whatever crazy policies are in, people are going to try to figure out a way to make it work.
I knew someone who was in the auto detailing business, and they became an expert and got certified in deep cleaning buildings, and were able to turn around and get that certification and do that. Again, this is the broken windows theory of economics, right? We would much rather have them, engaging in their business without sort of the government sort of creating these industries for them. Before I let you go, Phil, because you've been very generous with your time. Normally, I ask a question about sort of outside interests. What do you do? Because I think it's important to humanize people. When you're not engaging in policy work, you got a family, you don't have to talk about them if you don't want to. But what are you doing when you're not engaging in this kind of work? Or is it all consuming?
Well, the thing about me is that I'm always working and I'm never working, in that
you love what you do.
I care about this stuff. So I'm a Twitter addict. I'm going to be on there at all hours and whatever. And but because one of the good things about being the boss is also if there's something with the kids or a sport or whatever, I can leave in the middle of the day as long as I don't have a meeting or something like that.
Right.
And so I have a as I'm sort of always working and never working.
I get it.
And so it's very, from a lifestyle standpoint, it's great because my kids are 7th grade, 6th grade twins, and 3rd grade. And so they're young and they've got a lot of things going on in sports and all this kind of stuff. And so, it's pretty much that.
I get it.
It's pretty much work and kids stuff.
No, you got to do it. Well, listen, Phil, how do folks get the daily email that you do the first draft of, but Steve Moore puts his name on?
That is it's the Committee to Unleash Prosperity hotline. It's totally free.
Yeah.
Get it on committee-to-unleash-prosperity.com. I think it's pretty good. Andrew seems to enjoy it, so take a look at that. And also check out the American Commitment website and get on our email list there. Also, we send about one a week or so, but they're always action-oriented.
Yes.
It's always there's this fight and, send a comment to this regulatory agency or write a letter to Congress, that kind of thing. So 2 different mailing lists for the 2 different groups.
Folks are going to be hearing from you on both of these rulemakings at the FCC on digital discrimination and Title II, I'm sure.
One of the tricky things, and the left loves getting multiple shots on goal.
Sure, of course.
One of the tricky things is how we're going to explain to people that we need to hit these 2 different dockets that kind of overlap. And so I've already got the draft written for the Title II thing because I've been working on that for a month, and then they dropped this other
Right.
one. So I need to figure out mechanically how we get people mobilized for
we'll
both
talk more
of them.
about this. I appreciate that. Well, listen, Phil Kerpen, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Andrew.
Thank you. Well, that's the end of yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As I've said, please go and check us out on YouTube if you're listening to us on the many podcast platforms that are out there. If you're listening on one of those platforms, go and check us out on YouTube. Leave us a review. Send us leave us a comment, thumbs up, subscribe. Ultra important there. I am Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.